Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. You guys have been here for about 3 hours. And if you're like me, you might kind of feel like you've just been punched in the gut. Spent 3 hours with speaker after speaker coming through here telling you about some sobering statistics, in some cases some damning statistics in our population. The ever-evolving risk that we face on the fire ground, which is often not evolving for our purpose or for our preference. And the number of risks that we face in terms of how some of these exposures can get into the body and get onto the body and cause some of these changes. Importantly, we're not without recourse. This is one area where, as Kenny just mentioned, a research project that we're conducting at the University of Illinois Fire Service Institute with Steve and with Kenny can help to reduce some of these risks, to understand some simple things that we can put into place that you can do now. Some things require significant investment, and we need to continue to work for those investments so that the organization, labor, and management can work together in order to properly support and to resource and to protect your memberships from each of your locals. But there's also certain things that we can enact right now. This project, again, has been funded through the Department of Homeland Security through Fire Prevention Safety Grants, and I want to thank each of you for advocating for that, as the General President mentioned earlier. These programs come about, they require millions of dollars to fund research like this, but they also impact the fire service around the country and in many ways around the world as a result of the investment that we've made in the fire service together. So I want you to remember the research that we're conducting is not just about understanding what are the risks that we face. That's one important part, and again, it's evolving. We're really just getting to understand that. But critically, we need to understand how we can reduce those risks for your membership, for you. That's an important step. While this research helps to bring home the point why presumption is necessary in the fire service, why those protections are critical and needed, again, as the General President mentioned, what we're trying to do with this research is also reduce the number of people that need those protections. Reduce the number of people on your beautiful walls in Colorado. So we need to be able to have firefighters who are willing to accept some of these risks that come with the job and make some changes that can help reduce those risks. And again, the goal for us is not just to have firefighters who have a long and healthy and effective career in the fire service. We want an equally long and healthy and effective retirement so they can enjoy all the time that they spent protecting the citizens that you're sworn to protect, and they can go on and enjoy the rest of the time with your family after that. In order to do this, we have to accept that there are some risks that we face on the fire ground. Steve and Kenny mentioned these in quite a bit of detail. Typical room and contents fire, you might show up, we could look something like this. We obviously have a header, we obviously have smoke, we have fire. We don the gear as we normally have, but we often think about, when I first got on the job, donning the gear for protection from the thermal environment. Only recently have we started to understand that not only does that gear protect us from the temperature and from the cuts and from the bruises and the SCBA from the smoke so that we can breathe, but it also protects us from some of the long-term exposures that we might have on the fire ground. By the time we begin incident command, lay out that first line, put the pump in gear, this is the conditions we might face. Think about that. Before you even had a chance to don your SCBA, if you're not wearing it coming out of the apparatus cab, some of the initial exposures that we can have just before we enter the job. Obviously, going inside the environment, working in the fire itself, is where we expect to see the highest concentration. Some of the numbers that Kenny showed you are fascinating. The magnitude of the chemical exposure we have in there. We need that protection just so that we can work in there. Without the modern firefighting PPE, the suit, the bunker gear, the SCBA that we have, it would not be physically possible for us to do the job that we're called on to do. We need to remember, though, that when we're in there with that soot and with those particles and those products of combustion, they also come back out with us, because the gear protects us from those chemicals by providing a layer between us and the environment, but that environment then can come back out with us. But that's not where our exposures end. Think about working on an outside vent where oftentimes we don't have firefighters that are wearing their BA. It's hard even to see the firefighter in this scene. This is a simple room and contents fire for firefighters working in an outside vent condition. Some of the measurements that we've seen in those firefighters are well beyond what we had ever considered before. The amount of exposure we're finding on the neck for firefighters that never even will go into the firefight because of the soot and the smoke we find on the fire ground. And I want to reinforce the point that Kenny made in his presentation. While we focus a lot of our research this day and age on the dermal exposures, how these chemicals can get through the skin, the most important thing we need to protect is our airway. On the outside of the structure, many of these chemicals are 10 to 100 times more rapidly taken up into the body through the lungs than they are through the skin. So while we can go a great deal towards protecting our firefighters, worrying about the skin exposure just by enforcing policies, so the firefighters are wearing their BA from the beginning to the end of the firefight, not just when they're setting up, not just when they're on the inside, not just when they're doing outside vent, but as they're removing occupants from those structures who are likely contaminated by those products of combustion, while they're removing the structural contents during overhaul. All of these cases provide us opportunities where we can have airway exposures. One of the most important things that we can do for our membership is to ensure that we wear our SCBA from the beginning to end. Now, there's obviously some challenges this brings out, particularly in overhaul, right? If our firefighters are wearing air during overhaul, we know that increases the weight that they're carrying, increases some of the thermal strain that they're going to face, some of the cardiovascular strain that they're going to face. So we need to make sure not only are they wearing the right SCBA, but we have the appropriate manpower on scene to make sure that we can do this safely. So we can rotate members in and out. Some of the research can help you make that argument for why we need to have an appropriate level of manpower, not just for the initial firefight, but for that overhaul and that cleanup process that continues on from here. But what I want to talk most of my presentation on is what we can do about this, identifying that we are likely to have some level of contamination on the gear. It is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for a firefighter to do the job that has to be done and not have some level of exposure, at least to the gear. We need to figure out how we can get that exposure off of the gear and off the skin as rapidly as possible. And if you look at some of the national media organizations, as well as some of the National Cancer Awareness Organization, Firefighter Cancer Support Network, and others, there's a lot of best practices that exist out there so that we can figure out how we can get from this. Our firefighters that are done with the job, how can we get them cleaned up and get back in service? We know how to put the fire apparatus back in service. We're just trying to understand how to put the firefighter back in service. So how do we take these firefighters and clean them up? A lot of research, or a lot of best practices have been presented for how to do gross on-scene decontamination. The new NFPA 1851 document coming out, this is going to be called a PER. I didn't come up with a word, but Preliminary Exposure Reduction. Same basic concept, basically what we thought of as a decon. So we looked at this in part of our study. There's a lot of different ways you could decontaminate a firefighter, clean them up on scene so that they don't take any of that back with them, or reduce the amount of contamination they take back to the station, into their apparatus, or wherever else they might go. One of the first things that we want to look at is a wet on-scene decontamination, wet soap decon. Rinse down the gear, apply a little light soap product. In this case, we use a commercial off-the-shelf soap product. Figured it worked well for baby ducks and oil spills. It's gentle enough for firefighters. There's a lot of other types of soaps that exist out there, but that's what we use at this point. Something you could buy relatively inexpensively. Want to compare that. Now, a lot of people are saying, I can't do that. I don't want to get the gear wet. It might be cold if you're in Canada, and you say, well, I can't do that when it's 10 below. How effective are some dry decon techniques? Many of these have been proposed. Just using a brush to brush off the contamination from the gear. Or an air-based decon. A lot of different folks have looked at this. In our case, we just took an electric leaf blower, modified it slightly, and tried to blow the contamination off of the gear. You've probably heard one or many of these proposed and some of the best practices that exist out there, right? But they take some level of investment, either in terms of getting the right equipment, getting management to buy in, or even getting maybe your own members of your local to buy into this, the need for this. So as part of our study, we were able to quantify this for the very first time. And the good news is, again, using just commercial off-the-shelf soap, in a paper reported by Kenny Fent, you can find this freely available. I'll give you a link to it at the end of the presentation here. We're able to get about 85% of that contamination off of the gear with a decontamination technique very similar to what you might do in a hazmat incident. 85% of the PAH contamination with a wet soap decon. It's not perfect, but this is a win. This is a huge win for us, the fact that we can have an immediate impact in the amount of contamination that we're going to take back with us, and we might even carry around the fireground with us at that same time. I also want to look at dry decon. And unfortunately, we found the level of contamination we can get off with the brush technique was only about 25%. And on average, we really didn't have much effectiveness with air-based decon technique. This is a baseline. There's a lot of different tools that are being developed from this point, but this shows you the relative effectiveness in terms of what you might need to make an argument to have the investment in time and in personnel and in equipment to do a wet on-scene decontamination technique. This is a good thing for us. We're now working to compare that to how effective is laundering with extractors and other such things. That data is not quite there yet. Ourselves, as well as the group from NFPA, are trying to answer that question. But this is a step in the right direction. This is a win. This is information you can use, scientifically published data in the Journal of Occupational Environmental Hygiene that can be referenced to help you to make this call within your local departments. All right, so that's great. That's how we can clean the outside of the gear. But I also want to look at it another layer deeper. What if we peel that down one more level and look at the firefighter that's underneath that gear? We take off our gear, whether it's going into rehab at the end of the firefight, whatever that is, you'll often see pictures that look like this. Right? Around the jawline where we have some soot deposition, on the hands. You've seen multiple different pictures like these in the past. How do we clean that up? How do we take care of that rapidly? So another thing that's commonly being proposed in these best practice documents are using wipes. We began this study in 2015. At that point, there really weren't any commercially available wipes specific to the fire service. So we just used some commercial off-the-shelf wipes that we found at a local store. And again, in that same paper that Kenny published, what we found was 54% of the contamination can be removed with these skin wipes. 54%. That's over half of the contamination when a firefighter's out getting a bottle change before going into rehab. Immediately on scene, we can reduce the level of contamination on the firefighters by over half. It's important. The dose is not just the magnitude of the contamination on you, but how long it stays on your body. So the quicker we can get this off of the body, the less time it has to transition to be absorbed through the skin, particularly in the area of the neck, which Kenny identified as one that we are very concerned about. Relatively thin skin, relatively high absorption, often warm as a result of the firefight in the hood. 54%. Now, what's the downside to that? Those of you who are math whizzes could figure out very quickly that means about 46% of the soot remains on the firefighter. It doesn't mean that this is not effective, but what that means is we need to make sure that we rapidly get those firefighters who are exposed to heavy levels of contamination, get them back to their station, get them back where they can make a much more thorough cleaning, showering with soap so that they can remove as much contamination as rapidly as possible. Many of you have probably heard the shower within the hour mantra, right? Anyone aware of the science behind that? I personally don't know, but I think it's because it rhymes. That's how it's caught on, right? Don't worry about showering with the hour. Shower as rapidly as you possibly can. As quickly as we can release the firefighters, we can get them cleaned up, get half of the soot off of their necks and their hands as quickly as we can on scene, get them back to the station, and get that shower as rapidly as we possibly can. The idea of the first in, last out firefighter, we need to kind of see if we can pull away from that. That first in firefighter who's heavily exposed, heavily contaminated, we need to get them back and cleaned up and back in service rapidly as we possibly can. Bring in another crew to do overhaul and to do the cleanup and all those other tasks that we have to do to get the apparatus back in service, but get those firefighters back in service as quickly as we can. Now again, this requires a lot of investment, a lot of collaboration between labor and management to make sure that there's an understanding. This is the value of getting those firefighters back out. We're going to need more manpower at the scene in order to make sure that we are protecting our firefighters as rapidly as we possibly can. But showering as quickly as we can is critical for getting as much more of this contamination off as we possibly can. But I want to also take another step back behind this. One of the things I want to look at is what else could we do to even reduce the level of the contamination you see on the neck and on the hands. I'm not talking about changing tactics at this point, not talking about, in many cases, even changing equipment. What are some small process things that we can do? On the hierarchy of controls, one of the first things we should really start looking at as opposed to getting new equipment, new PPE, is the process in which we don and doff that personal protective equipment. So let's take a step back. Looking at the hands. These are firefighters who had clean hands before they went in. And they came out, you saw all sorts of different levels of contamination on hands. Actually, they were in a nearly identical environment doing nearly identically the same amount of work. So how is it possible you can have this huge difference in the range of contamination on the hands? And I want you to think about how often you take your gloves off and put your gloves back on the fire ground. And what do you do when you take them off and put them back on? We know that the hands are going to be just as contaminated as the bunker gear, in some cases even more so. Are you walking back to the rig to get the bottle change? Are you walking back to rehab with your gloves on like this? Or with all that contamination was on the outside of your gloves, now on the inside of your hand? We largely contribute this exposure to being put onto the skin during the firefight itself, because we've never really looked at it before. We just put firefighters in that were clean. By the time they came back after rehab, they were dirty. We didn't know how. Now we're starting to look at what happens to get from point A to point B. Well, think about what you do when you take off your gloves. This is pretty simple, right? Firefighter taking off their gloves takes a number of seconds to take those gloves off. Just a few seconds to take those gloves off. Clean hands before, now got contaminated hands afterwards. Can we make a small change in the process of doffing those gloves just to make sure we're not touching the outside of the gloves? It might take another second or so in terms of doffing those gloves. But the difference in the contamination we have on our hand is obvious, just by a very simple change in how we teach our firefighters to take their gloves off. And I would submit this is not new to us. Many of us work in medical services or have worn nitrile gloves. I've never seen someone take a nitrile glove off any way other than this, being very careful not to touch the outside of those gloves. And we do that because we're trained to do that way from the very first time we put the nitrile gloves on, because we don't want to touch those body substances that are on the outside of that glove. We respect the contamination on the outside of those nitrile EMS gloves. If we could do the same thing with teaching our firefighters how to respect the contamination on the outside of their bunker gear, this isn't going to affect how we fight fires. This isn't going to really be a significant investment. We can have a significant impact on the contamination just that we get at the end of the firefight itself. So this is a picture we posted a few months back that received some significant interest in the fire service. 2 firefighters doing the exact same work in the exact same environment. One on the left took off his own gloves, the one on the right, the gloves were taken off so he didn't touch them. It's the only difference between the contamination on those hands. And again, I want to reinforce another point that Kenny made earlier. The hands are one of the most important vehicles for contamination. Think about that. One of the first things that often comes off, at least in my case, is gloves, right? Take your gloves off. Then when everything else comes off, you got sweat, so you're wiping the sweat off your face. Might have a little snot coming out, so you're getting it into all the mucous membranes, wiping your eyes out. Going to rehab. Anyone been assigned a knife and fork in rehab? Everything's hand food, right? Finger food. And gentlemen, if you paid attention to the presentation that Kenny had, we're really concerned about the absorption of the skin through the neck. Well, remember what the highest absorption was. So next you go to the bathroom after a firefight and you don't wash your hands before using the bathroom, consider where you're going to have the most rapid absorption of any of these contaminants in your hands. Hands are one of the most critical aspects, and if we can just do a small change, take 1 second longer to doff these gloves, we can potentially have a significant impact just by looking at the process. You can find a full video on our YouTube channel here. We've got a 2.5-minute video that kind of discusses this, as well as the next little section I want to talk about, which is the hood. So what about reducing contamination from the hood? This is an area where our PPE manufacturers have done a great job at developing new equipment to reduce the risk for contamination to get onto our neck. Multiple different hoods that have been released the last few years at FDIC. So if we take a look at this, this is what a firefighter might look like when they get done with their activities, starting to doff their gear. And if we have these hoods now, which would not allow any soot to come through, instead of having a soot on the neck, all that soot would be sitting on the outside of that hood. This is a good deal, right? If we can keep all that soot from getting through the hood and staying on the outside, we've had a big win. And I commend the PPE manufacturers for going after this with such vigor. But think about what we do next. What's the next step after our helmet is off? Where's that hood going? All that soot and all that contamination, if you do it the way that we typically do, is going right back down around your neck. So we can defeat all of the benefits of this new type of PPE if we don't also look at how we doff the gear. So again, we just put together another quick little video on this, just looking at the process of pulling the hood off. This might not work for everyone. Right? This might not be realistic, but we could start thinking as a fire service of different ways that we can put the gear on and take the gear off. We can maybe start working with manufacturers so that the gear it's just as important so we can get the gear off safely as it is to put the gear on safely and rapidly. If we make a small change now, instead of that coming down around the neck, it goes around. You can even stay on air throughout here and pull the hood off with the mask over the front and instead of coming down the way that we traditionally do. What's the difference in the contamination on the neck? Pretty significant. Now, in this case, we were just using a chalk powder contaminant. We weren't intentionally contaminating poor Richard here. But this is the type of things that we can very quickly look at how contamination gets moved from one part of our gear to the other, very similar to the fluorescent dye study that you've seen in the past. And small changes like this can reduce that cross-contamination. So we can start to understand how much of the contamination comes from the firefight and how much contamination is coming, are we putting on ourselves after our gear has done the job that it is designed to do. Again, this might not work for everyone, but this is something that we suggest you all consider and think about what you can do in your departments to doff the gear in a way that is controllable. Now, this picture probably doesn't require any explanation, right? Most of you have been through this. At Proby School, how many hours, and by the end of the months, how many days do you spend doing donning drills? Getting that gear on as rapidly as you can, covering everything else up as quickly as you can, a minute, 45 seconds, whatever your benchmark is. And as soon as we get all that gear on, what's usually the next step? Just take it off and get it ready for service. Is there a way we can spend just a couple minutes during the doffing to say, hey, why don't we practice taking our gloves off so we don't touch the outside? Maybe we can think about taking these hoods off in a different way so we can spend just a little bit of time thinking about doffing as much as we do with donning the gears. A very small change, something that could have an important impact. So we've covered a lot of material, right? And this is a toolkit that Steve mentioned earlier. I want to just go in a little bit more detail on this with you. This is something that's freely available. We released in December. We want to get the information out there at whatever level you're interested in absorbing it. So on this toolkit, you can find tools ranging from science to translation to teaching. And so what each of those means from the science tool. You want the papers that give you the data and the information behind some of these recommendations, you can find it there. You can download them for free. We've paid a little bit of extra money so that we have the copyright ownership for them. We can put them up there, and you can get that without having to track down through some scientific journal. You want to be able to reference that directly when you're making your arguments to management, to the village, to whatever else that is. They're freely available. Many of you might care a little bit more about the translation. What can I do with this information? And in that case, there's a series of translation tools which you can find. There are documents written by us, written by others, that are being put in a language and in a way that hopefully can be implemented by the fire departments, realizing that everyone has a different reality. We can't tell you how exactly to do this in your fire department, but we can give you some examples of how it's being done in other places. And then some teaching tools. This is a case where we have webinars we've done for FDIC or Envisage that we can link to right here so you can see with the research scientists translating this research for you, working on an online program which UL does for all of their studies. Hopefully it's going to be available early this year. That release can help you work through that material on your own. If you want to sign it for a 1-hour training some night, it's available for you to freely download from this site. Right now this information is really here from the Fireground study. We're going to continue to update this with training fire study, with the PPE cleaning study information to make that available as quickly and as rapidly to you as it possibly can. We are happy to take any questions, insights, any thoughts or questions you might have on this type of work. But before I go, I want to leave you with just a couple more resources. This is the website to get to that toolkit. Steve showed this earlier. We put everything out as rapidly as we can on Facebook and Twitter to engage the fire service when we have our next research study, to get feedback from those, as well as to make sure that we are putting the message out across the fire service, not just as a local research project, as a national research project. So again, as I leave, I want to remind you that this research here is trying to address what are the issues that we have and what are the things that we can do to reduce those risks. So thank you for everything that you do for your hometowns, for the people that you protect, and I hope that this will help you not only have a successful career, but a successful and long retirement. Thank you.